Hello and welcome back to Infidelity Tales Lab. We're grateful for each view and comment. Tell us, from which country or city are you watching today? We enjoy connecting with our global audience. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. Iron Fortress. Lawrence Merritt, known to most as Law, was not a man built on compromise. At 42, he had carved his legacy with calloused hands and an unforgiving mind. The scars on his knuckles told stories of battles fought long before he became owner of Ironclad Security, the most elite private security firm in Boston. The December wind bit through his tailored overcoat as he left the office. Snow gathered on the shoulders of his 6'3" frame, melting against the heat that seemed to perpetually radiate from his body. His employees called it the Merritt burn, the intensity he carried like a second skin. Heading home early, "Boss?" asked Garrett Sullivan, his head of operations. The man had served with Law and the Rangers before joining his security business. "Anniversary," Law replied, checking his watch, a Rolex his wife Natalie had given him 5 years ago. 15 years. Hard to believe. Garrett's expression shifted subtly. Law caught it. He caught everything. "Something wrong?" "No, just surprised. Didn't think you were the anniversary type." Garrett's eyes dropped to his computer screen too quickly. Law lingered a moment longer than necessary. After 15 years in special operations and another 10 running a security company, he developed an uncanny ability to sense when something was off. But he dismissed it. Natalie was waiting, and despite his demanding nature, she'd never given him reason to doubt her. Their marriage was the one fortress he believed impenetrable. "See you Monday," he said, turning away. The drive to their colonial-style home in Newton took 30 minutes. Law used the time to mentally transition from the cutthroat business world to husband mode. Natalie deserved that much. She'd stood by him when he'd returned from his final deployment with nightmares and a temper he couldn't always control. She'd supported him when he started Ironclad with nothing but his military connections and a ruthless determination to succeed. As he turned onto his street, his phone buzzed. A text from his younger brother, "Russell, need to talk." "It's important." Law frowned. Russell, 10 years his junior, was the family screw-up, always in some kind of trouble. He silenced the phone. Whatever drama Russell had created could wait until after his anniversary. He pulled into the driveway of the home he and Natalie had renovated together. 3 bedrooms they'd never filled with children, a mutual decision after Law's childhood. Growing up with Vernon and Patricia Merritt had taught him families sometimes cause more pain than they're worth. The house was dark. Law checked his watch again, 7:30 p.m. Natalie's car wasn't in the driveway. He entered through the front door, calling her name. No answer. On the kitchen counter sat a note in her elegant handwriting. "Working late. Don't wait up. N." Law's jaw tightened. This wasn't like her. Not on their anniversary. He pulled out his phone and called her office at Boston General Hospital, where she worked as a neurologist. "Dr. Merritt left at 5, replied the night nurse. Law hung up without another word. The coil of suspicion that had started with Garrett's odd behavior tightened in his gut. He dialed Natalie's cell. It went straight to voicemail. That's when he noticed it. Her rarely used Chanel perfume lingering in the air. She'd been home recently and changed. Law moved through the house systematically, checking rooms with the precision of his military training. Nothing seemed out of place until he reached their bedroom. The closet door was ajar, and Natalie's overnight bag was missing. The uneasy feeling crystallized into something sharper. He opened her dresser drawer, several items gone. He checked the bathroom. Her essential toiletries missing. This wasn't a late night at work. This was something else. He sat on the edge of the bed, his mind racing through possibilities when his phone rang. Russell again. This time, Law answered. "I've been trying to reach you." Russell's voice was tight. "Law, there's something you need to know about Natalie." Chapter 2. Ruins. Law's hands gripped the steering wheel as he tore through the empty streets toward Russell's apartment in Cambridge. His brother's words had been cryptic but devastating. "I've seen Natalie with someone. Multiple times. I didn't want to believe it, but today I overheard them talking about leaving. Tonight. I'm sorry, Law." The streetlights cast intermittent glows across his face, highlighting the hard angles of his clenched jaw. He hadn't asked questions, Russell knew better than to make accusations without proof. Law parked haphazardly outside Russell's building and took the stairs two at a time. Russell opened the door before he could knock, his face pale. "Show me," Law demanded. Russell led him to a laptop. "I took these last week. I was at Bonder having lunch when I saw them." The photos showed Natalie sitting across from a man Law didn't recognize, tall, blonde, professionally dressed. In one image, the man's hand covered Natalie's on the table. "Who is he?" "His name is Alexander Voss. He's a pharmaceutical executive. I did some digging." Russell handed Law a folder. "They've been seen together for at least 6 months." Law flipped through public records and social media screenshots. Alexander Voss, 38, divorced, no children. Chief Marketing Officer at Helix Pharmaceuticals. "There's more," Russell said quietly. "Today I followed them to their meeting spot. I heard them talking about a property sale." "Your property, Law." Law's head snapped up. "What property?" "The lake house in New Hampshire. Your grandfather's place." The revelation hit him like a physical blow. The lake house had been in the Merritt family for 3 generations. His grandfather had willed it directly to Law, knowing how much it meant to him. It was the only place Law had felt safe as a child, the only location tied to happy memories. "That's not possible. Natalie can't sell it. It's not in her name." Russell slid another document across the table. "You made her your power of attorney 3 years ago when you were having those surgeries on your knee." Law remembered. He'd undergone 3 operations after an old military injury flared up. The power of attorney was meant to be temporary, but he'd never revoked it. It hadn't seemed necessary. "The sale closes tomorrow," Russell continued. "They're meeting tonight with some documents before they leave town. I overheard them at the cafe. They mentioned Gardner Street storage." "Where?" Law's voice had gone dangerously quiet. "Unit 423. They rented it under her name." Law stood, his mind calculating, planning. "You have keys to this place?" Russell hesitated, then went to a drawer. "Got a buddy who works there." He handed over a key card. "Law, what are you going to do?" Law pocketed the card. "Nothing they don't deserve." As he turned to leave, his phone rang. Unknown number. "Mr. Merritt?" An authoritative voice asked. "This is Officer Reynolds with Boston PD. Sir, you need to come to your address. There's been an incident." Law's blood ran cold. "What kind of incident?" "I'm not at liberty to say over the phone, sir. Please come as soon as possible." Law ended the call and looked at Russell. "The police are in my house." Russell's eyes widened. "You think Natalie—" "I don't know, but I'm going to find out." 20 minutes later, Law pulled into his driveway, now flanked by 2 police cruisers. As he approached the front door, he saw Natalie standing in the doorway, her face streaked with tears. Behind her stood his parents, Vernon and Patricia Merritt, who had supposedly been vacationing in Florida. His father stepped forward, gripping Law's arm with surprising strength for a man in his 70s. "Son, she didn't mean for it to go this far." Natalie whimpered, her voice barely audible. "Don't let him see the garage." Law shoved past them all, ignoring the protests of the officer who tried to block his path. He flung open the garage door and stopped dead. Russell lay on the concrete floor, blood pooling beneath his head. A uniformed officer knelt beside him, checking for vital signs and finding none. Next to Russell's body was a crowbar with distinctive handle markings. Law's crowbar, taken from the toolbox he kept in this very garage. "Mr. Merritt," the officer approached cautiously. "Your wife called us. She says she came home and found your brother like this. Do you have any idea what happened here?" Law's mind raced. The pieces didn't fit. Why would Russell be here? Why would he drive separately? And then it clicked. He wouldn't. This was staged. Law turned slowly to face Natalie, whose tears now seemed calculated rather than genuine. His parents' presence made even less sense, until he remembered they'd always favored Russell, always jumped to his defense. "Officer," Law said carefully, "I think you should know that my brother contacted me earlier about my wife's affair. I was just with him at his apartment in Cambridge." The officer frowned. "Sir, your wife says you've been unstable lately, angry about financial issues. She feared you might harm yourself or others." Law understood with crystal clarity. This wasn't just about an affair or selling the lake house. This was about framing him. They'd killed Russell. the only person who knew what they were planning, and set Law up to take the fall. As the officer began reading him his rights, Law caught sight of a small storage unit key that had fallen from Russell's pocket, partially hidden beneath his body. The same type Russell had given him minutes ago. He knew then what he had to do. The evidence that would exonerate him and condemn them was waiting at Gardner Street Storage. He just had to get to it. "I'd like to speak to my lawyer," he said, his voice eerily calm as the handcuffs closed around his wrists. Chapter 3: Foundation of Vengeance. The interrogation room at Boston Police Department headquarters held a familiar chill. Law had been in rooms like this before, but on the other side of the table. During his military career, he'd conducted enough interrogations to know every technique. Detective Malone, a veteran cop with salt and pepper hair and tired eyes, took the seat across from him. "Mr. Merritt, you're in a world of trouble." Law remained silent, his lawyer, Benjamin Hargrove, beside him. Ben was Ironclad's legal counsel and one of the few people Law genuinely trusted. "We have your crowbar with your fingerprints covered in your brother's blood," Malone continued. "Your wife and parents both state you've been increasingly paranoid, making accusations, threatening violence. Ask them about Gardner Street Storage, Unit 423, Law said evenly. The detective faltered. "What?" "My brother discovered my wife was having an affair with Alexander Voss. They were planning to sell my family property and leave town tonight. The evidence is in that storage unit." Malone studied him. "That's convenient. Check Russell's phone records. He called me twice tonight. Check the traffic cameras outside his Cambridge apartment building. You'll see me arriving and leaving. It's physically impossible for me to have killed him when your me says he died." Ben added, "We're requesting you verify Mr. Merritt's alibi before proceeding further." 3 hours later, Law was released. The traffic cameras had confirmed his story, and the medical examiner had placed Russell's time of death during Law's documented visit to Cambridge. It wasn't enough to arrest anyone else, but it was enough to clear him temporarily. "They'll try again," Ben warned as they left the station. "They've invested too much in this plan." Law nodded, his expression unreadable. "Give me everything you can on Alexander Voss. I want to know every skeleton in his closet. What about Natalie? Your parents?" Law's eyes were cold. They chose their side. While Ben made calls, Law drove to Gardner Street Storage. The facility was deserted at 2 a.m. He used Russell's key card to enter, then made his way to Unit 423. Inside, he found what he expected: boxes of documents, a laptop, and several flash drives. He took everything. In his hotel room, Law methodically went through the evidence. The documents revealed a sophisticated plan. Alexander Voss wasn't just having an affair with Natalie. He was using her to access confidential patient information for Boston General. Specifically, patients participating in clinical trials for experimental treatments from competing pharmaceutical companies. This industrial espionage had been going on for over a year. The Lake House sale was just part of their exit strategy. They'd planned to frame Law for Russell's murder, ensuring he couldn't come after them while they disappeared with the proceeds from selling his property and the payoff from Helix Pharmaceuticals. Most damning of all was a series of text messages between Natalie and Voss, discussing how to handle Russell after he confronted them with his suspicions. Law's parents' involvement became clear too. Financial records showed large transfers from Voss to their accounts. They'd been paid to corroborate Natalie's story about Law's supposed instability. By morning, Law had compiled enough evidence to have them all arrested. But as the sun rose over Boston, he put the incriminating files aside. The legal system would give them deals, reduced sentences, perhaps even immunity for testimony. That wasn't good enough. They had taken everything from him: his brother, his marriage, his family legacy. They had tried to take his freedom. A conventional punishment wouldn't balance those scales. Law picked up his phone and called Garrett Sullivan. "I need the team," he said simply. "All of them. It's time to go to work." When Garrett arrived at the hotel with 5 other former special operators, men who had served with Law and now worked for Ironclad, Law laid out what had happened. "So what's the plan, boss?" asked Diego Contreras, Law's surveillance expert. Law unfolded a map of Boston. "We're not going to kill them. That's too quick, too clean." His finger traced a route across the city. "We're going to destroy them. piece by piece. Everything they care about, everything they are. He looked up at the men who had followed him through war zones and now stood ready to follow him through this personal hell. By the time we're done, they'll wish they were dead. Chapter 4. The Architect's Design. 3 weeks passed. Law moved through the world like a ghost, watching his targets establish their new normal. They believed they were safe. Natalie had returned home after Law's release, maintaining her innocence while secretly communicating with Voss. His parents had gone back to Florida, confident the police would eventually find evidence against their eldest son. They were all wrong. Law had rented an apartment under a false name, converting the spare bedroom into an operations center. The walls were covered with photographs, timelines, and connection maps, a meticulous blueprint for dismantling 5 lives. Surveillance is complete, Diego reported, entering with a fresh stack of photos. Voss follows the same routine every day. Natalie's been careful, but they're meeting at the Marriott twice a week. Law pinned the new images to the wall. And my parents? Your father's gambling again. For trips to the casino this week. Your mother's spending the money as fast as he loses it. Law nodded, unsurprised. His father's gambling addiction had destroyed their family finances decades ago. It seemed old habits returned quickly when cash was available. Garrett entered, carrying coffee. Hospital board meeting minutes, he said, sliding a folder across the table. Natalie's up for department chair next month. The vote looks favorable. Law opened the folder. Not for long. The final member of the team, Calvin Reese, arrived with a laptop. I've finished analyzing Voss's financial records. He's leveraged to the hilt. The money he promised your parents was supposed to come from a bonus that's now in jeopardy. Helix is investigating data irregularities. Law smiled for the first time in weeks. Perfect. The men gathered around the table as Law outlined Phase 1. Calvin, I want everything Voss gave my parents back in their accounts by morning, plus an additional $50,000. Make it look like he's getting nervous, trying to buy more loyalty. Won't be a problem, Calvin replied. He'd been NSA before joining Law's team. Diego, I need photos of my father at the casino, my mother shopping, and the money transfers. Deliver them to Voss's private email with a message suggesting my parents are becoming a liability. Consider it done. Law turned to Garrett. It's time to introduce Dr. Reynolds to the hospital board. The following day, an anonymous package arrived at Boston General Hospital addressed to the board of directors. Inside was a detailed dossier documenting how Dr. Natalie Merritt had accessed confidential patient files outside her department, files connected to clinical trials from pharmaceutical companies competing with Helix. Simultaneously, an SEC whistleblower report was filed against Alexander Voss, detailing suspicious stock transactions timed perfectly with the release of competitors' trial results. That evening, Law watched from his car as Natalie emerged from the hospital, her face ashen. Her phone rang. Voss, no doubt, experiencing his own professional implosion. Law didn't need to hear the conversation to know its content. Panic. Accusations. The first cracks in their alliance. He followed Natalie to a bar where she met Voss. Through the window, he watched their heated exchange, saw Voss grab her arm too tightly, noticed how she pulled away with newfound fear in her eyes. Phase 1 was complete. Doubt had been planted. 2 days later, Natalie received another package, this one at home. Inside were photos of Voss meeting with Law's parents, handing over an envelope. The timestamp showed it was after Russell's murder. A note read, "Who do you think he'll sacrifice first?" Meanwhile, Voss found his corporate credit cards suddenly maxed out with charges at escort services. His ex-wife received documentation of undisclosed assets from their divorce. The IRS received an anonymous tip about offshore accounts. Law orchestrated it all with cold precision, each move designed to isolate his targets, turn them against each other, and systematically dismantle the foundations of their lives. "They're crumbling," Garrett observed as they watched Natalie and Voss argue in the Marriott parking lot a week later. "She slapped him." Law nodded. Phase 2 begins tomorrow. The next morning, Detective Malone received a package containing partial evidence from the storage unit. Enough to reopen the investigation into Russell's death, but not enough to immediately arrest anyone. When police arrived at Voss's office with questions, security footage showed him become physically ill, vomiting in a trash can before fleeing the building. That night, Natalie didn't come home. Law's parents called her repeatedly, leaving increasingly frantic messages. They could sense the tide turning. Law watched from the shadows as his carefully constructed demolition plan executed flawlessly. The architect of their destruction remained invisible while they tore each other apart brick by brick. Chapter 5. The Excavation. 1 month into his campaign, Law decided it was time to dig deeper. Surface destruction wasn't enough. He needed to expose the foundations. "What do we know about Voss before Helix?" he asked his team. Calvin pulled up a series of documents. He worked for 3 pharmaceutical companies in 5 years. Left each one under unusual circumstances. Unusual how? Nothing official in his record, but I found sealed court documents. Calvin opened a file. 2 sexual harassment settlements and 1 accusation of data manipulation that was dropped when the witness suddenly recanted. Law absorbed this information. Find the witnesses. All of them. Within days, they had names and locations. The sexual harassment victims, both former administrative assistants, had signed NDAs with substantial payouts. The data manipulation whistleblower had left the industry entirely, now teaching high school chemistry in New Hampshire. Law dispatched Diego to approach the teacher, Nathan Browning, while he personally visited the first harassment victim, Melissa Davidson. He found her working at a small marketing firm in Providence. When he introduced himself, her reaction told him everything. "I have nothing to say about Alexander Voss," she said, voice tight with anxiety. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Law assured her. "I'm here because he's hurting more people." Her resistance crumbled slowly as Law explained the situation, carefully omitting his relationship to the players involved. He presented himself as a private investigator working with other victims. "The NDA doesn't protect criminal behavior," he reminded her gently. "And you wouldn't be alone this time." By the end of their conversation, she'd agreed to contact the other victim and consider coming forward. Meanwhile, Diego reported success with Nathan Browning. "He's been waiting for this moment," Diego said. "Says Voss falsified clinical trial data that could have harmed patients. He only recanted because Voss threatened his family." Law added these new threads to his web. "Get them all to Detective Malone. Anonymous tips, but credible ones." While the police investigation intensified, Law turned his attention to Natalie. Her professional reputation was already damaged by the board's investigation, but he wanted to understand what had transformed the woman he thought he knew into someone capable of murder. Calvin discovered the answer in her email archives. Years of correspondence between Natalie and Voss predated their affair. They'd known each other since medical school, maintained contact through mutual colleagues, and reconnected at a conference 18 months ago. More disturbing were draft emails Natalie had never sent, journal entries she'd typed but never published. They revealed a woman who had grown to resent her husband's intensity, his absolutism, his uncompromising nature. She'd felt trapped in his shadow, her own ambitions secondary to his. Law read these private thoughts without emotion, analyzing them as he would intelligence reports on an enemy combatant. The woman who had written these words was a stranger to him now. The final piece fell into place when Calvin uncovered Voss's financial motives. His lavish lifestyle had left him deeply in debt. The industrial espionage at Boston General had been his idea, with promises of executive promotion and bonuses once the stolen research helped Helix outperform competitors. Law's parents were simpler. They'd always favored Russell and resented Law's success after they'd repeatedly predicted his failure. The money was just a bonus on top of helping their preferred son. As for Russell's murder, the evidence suggested an opportunistic decision rather than a long-planned action. Russell had confronted them at the wrong moment, threatened to expose everything, and Voss had reacted violently. Natalie and his parents had helped cover it up, seeing a chance to solve multiple problems at once by framing Law. With the complete picture now clear, Law finalized Phase 3, the controlled demolition. First, he anonymously delivered Voss's hidden offshore account details to Helix's board of directors, the SEC, and the FBI simultaneously. Next, he arranged for Natalie's private journal entries, the ones expressing her resentment, to reach Voss through an untraceable email, suggesting Natalie was preparing to cooperate with authorities and blame everything on him. For his parents, he sent financial records showing Voss had been transferring funds back out of their accounts. A manipulation by Calvin, but they wouldn't know that. Then he waited, watching the inevitable implosion through surveillance cameras Diego had planted. Voss confronted Natalie at her office, accusing her of betrayal. Their argument became so heated that hospital security intervened, creating an official incident report. Law's parents called Voss repeatedly, demanding explanations for the missing money. When he refused to answer, they panicked and booked flights back to Boston. The trap was set. All the principal players would soon be in one location, each believing the others had betrayed them, each desperate to save themselves. Law looked at the chaos he had orchestrated and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. The excavation was complete. Now it was time to collapse the entire structure. Chapter 6. The cornerstones crumble. The breaking point came faster than even Law had anticipated. Alexander Voss was arrested outside his apartment, building on securities fraud charges. The FBI had moved quickly on the evidence they'd received. Law watched from across the street as Voss was led away, still wearing pajama bottoms with his hastily donned dress shirt. Within hours, news of the arrest reached Natalie. Law observed through the surveillance equipment as she frantically packed a suitcase, making calls that went unanswered. Her carefully constructed world was collapsing, and her accomplices were nowhere to be found. His parents arrived in Boston that afternoon, checking into a downtown hotel rather than going to Law's house where Natalie still lived. Their distrust was growing. All these developments pleased Law, but it wasn't enough. They were scattering, each looking to escape individually. He needed them together for his final act. "It's time for me to make contact," he told his team that evening. Garrett frowned. "You sure that's wise? Right now, they think you're oblivious." Law checked his watch. "That changes tonight." At precisely 8 p.m., Law called his parents' hotel room. "Hello, Father," he said when Vernon answered. The silence that followed was deafening. "Lawrence," Vernon finally managed, voice shaking. "We've been worried about you." "No, you haven't," Law replied evenly. "But you should be now." Before Vernon could respond, Law continued. "I know everything. About Russell. About Natalie and Voss. About the money. And I have proof. Son, you're confused. I'm meeting Natalie at the lake house tomorrow at noon. You and Mother should be there too. One chance to explain yourselves before I take everything to Detective Malone." He hung up without waiting for a response, then sent Natalie a text message. "I know about Voss. Meet me at the lake house tomorrow at noon if you want a chance to explain before I go to the police." His final call was to Voss's attorney, informing him that he had evidence proving Voss had murdered Russell Merritt and framed Lawrence Merritt for the crime. He offered to bring this evidence to the lake house at noon the following day, suggesting it might help with bail negotiations. The pieces were in motion. The next morning, Law's team established positions around the lake house. The remote property, situated on 20 wooded acres with its own dock on Lake Winnipesaukee, offered perfect isolation for what would follow. Law entered alone at 11 a.m., carrying a briefcase containing the complete evidence of their crimes. He set it on the large oak dining table, the same table where his grandfather had taught him to play chess, where he'd learned that sometimes you had to sacrifice pieces to win the game. Natalie arrived first, 30 minutes early, hoping to speak to Law alone. She froze when she saw him standing by the fireplace, his expression unreadable. "Law," she began, her voice attempting warmth while her eyes darted nervously. "Thank you for giving me a chance to explain." He didn't respond, merely gesturing toward a chair. She sat, clutching her purse like a shield. "I know how this looks, but Alex and it wasn't planned. It just happened. And then things got complicated with his work, and—" "Stop lying," Law said quietly. "I know everything. The patient files, the insider trading. Russell." The color drained from her face. "Russell was an accident. Alex got angry, they fought. In my garage? With my crowbar? That's quite an accident." Before she could fabricate more excuses, the door opened again. Vernon and Patricia entered, faltering when they saw Natalie already there. "Sit down," Law commanded, and his parents obeyed instinctively. Minutes later, a luxury SUV pulled into the driveway. Alexander Voss had made bail. He entered cautiously, surprise registering when he saw the assembled group. "What is this?" he demanded. Law smiled without humor. "This is Judgment Day." He opened the briefcase, removing 5 identical folders. He placed one in front of each person, keeping one for himself. Inside, you'll find comprehensive documentation of your crimes: securities fraud, industrial espionage, conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice. The accusations hung in the air like smoke. The police have received copies as well, but with a time delay. They'll arrive in approximately. He checked his watch. 1 hour. Panic erupted. Voss lunged for the door, only to find it blocked by Garrett. Natalie began sobbing. Vernon turned purple with rage, while Patricia seemed to shrink in her chair. "Why are you doing this?" Natalie cried. "If you know everything, why not just let the police handle it?" Law's expression hardened. "Because the legal system might show mercy. I won't." He retrieved a remote control from his pocket and pressed a button. The large television screen on the wall activated, showing footage of Russell confronting Voss and Natalie at the storage unit. The argument escalated until Voss struck Russell with the crowbar. The murder captured in horrifying clarity. "You recorded it," Voss whispered, staggered. "Russell did," Law corrected. "My brother was smarter than you gave him credit for. He suspected you might try something, so he set up a camera. His final gift to me." This was a lie. Calvin had created the footage using deepfake technology and footage from the storage facility security cameras, but they couldn't know that. "What do you want?" Vernon finally asked, his arrogance crumbling. Law sat at the head of the table, folding his hands. "I want you to destroy each other." He pushed a document toward the center of the table. "This is a confession for Russell's murder. One of you needs to sign it in the next 30 minutes, or all of you go down together." "You're insane," Voss spat. Law leaned forward. "No, I'm giving you a chance one of you doesn't deserve. 4 people in this room were involved in killing my brother and framing me. One of you actually wielded the crowbar. That person should pay the most severe price." He let the implication hang. One confession might lead to a deal. Collective denial would damn them all equally. The psychological trap was elegant in its simplicity. Law had designed it to exploit the fractures he'd been creating for weeks. Now, under pressure, those fractures would become chasms. It began with accusations. Voss claiming Natalie had suggested framing Law, Natalie insisting the murder was entirely Voss's idea, Vernon and Patricia protesting they'd only helped afterward out of fear. As the minutes ticked by, the accusations grew more specific, more damning. Details emerged that even Law hadn't known. How Natalie had given Voss the garage code, how his mother had suggested using Law's crowbar, how his father had helped position Russell's body. Law recorded everything, adding new evidence to their collective doom while watching the people who had betrayed him tear each other apart. When police sirens sounded in the distance, genuine panic set in. Voss grabbed the confession, scrawling his name with a caveat that the others had been equal participants. Natalie lunged for it, trying to add her own version. Vernon attempted to flee through the back door, only to be stopped by Diego. As officers surrounded the house, Law stood calmly. His revenge wasn't in seeing them arrested. That was merely justice. His revenge was in watching them betray each other as thoroughly as they had betrayed him, destroying any chance of unified defense or mitigated sentences. He had orchestrated their complete destruction, and as Detective Malone led them away in handcuffs, their faces contorted with hatred for each other rather than for him. Law knew his vengeance was complete. Or so he thought. Chapter 7. The Inspection. 6 months passed. The trial of Alexander Voss for the murder of Russell Merritt dominated Boston media. Natalie and Law's parents faced lesser charges as accessories, each with separate attorneys throwing the others under the proverbial bus. Law testified clinically, describing the frame-up attempt without emotion. The jury took only 4 hours to convict Voss. He received life without parole. Natalie accepted a plea deal for 20 years. Vernon and Patricia Merritt, despite their advanced age, were sentenced to 15 years each. Justice had been served, but Law felt no closure. He stood on the dock of the lake house, watching the sunset paint the water crimson. The property that had nearly been stolen from him now felt tainted by their betrayal. He'd considered selling it, but couldn't bring himself to part with his grandfather's legacy. Garrett approached, footsteps creaking on the wooden planks. "It's over, boss. You won." Law didn't turn. "Then why doesn't it feel like victory?" "Because you lost too much in the process." This simple truth hung between them. Law had destroyed his enemies, but they had taken parts of him first: his marriage, his brother, his faith in family. "The team's worried about you," Garrett continued. "You've been different since the trial." Law finally faced his friend. "I've been efficient, focused. You've been obsessed. Ironclad is thriving, but you're working 20-hour days, sleeping on your office couch. That's not living, Law. That's existing." Law had no answer for this. Since the trial, he'd poured himself into ironclad security, expanding operations, pursuing government contracts with relentless determination. The company had doubled in size, but as Garrett implied, success felt hollow. "I have a proposition," Garrett said. "The government contract in Kiev. Send me instead. Take some time off." Law frowned. "I don't need time off." "Yes, you do. You need to figure out what comes next. The vengeance chapter is finished. What's the next chapter about?" The question lingered as Garrett left Law alone with his thoughts. That night, Law dreamed of Russell for the first time since his death. They were fishing on the lake, as they had done as children. Dream Russell looked at him with sad eyes. "You got them, big brother. But at what cost?" Law woke before dawn, the question echoing. He drove back to Boston in silence, his mind churning. At the office, he found Calvin working early, as usual. "I need information," Law said without preamble. Calvin nodded, unsurprised. "On who?" "Alexander Voss. Everything before Boston. Family, relationships, business dealings. I thought we were done with him. There's something missing. A piece I never found." Calvin hesitated, then nodded. "I'll dig deeper. What exactly are we looking for?" "I don't know yet," Law admitted. But Voss was too confident, too protected. Someone was watching his back. While Calvin worked, Law reviewed the trial transcripts. Something had bothered him during Voss's testimony. A reference to a mentor who had guided his career, someone powerful enough to make problems disappear. The name had never been mentioned, dismissed by the prosecutor as irrelevant to the murder charge. 3 days later, Calvin brought the answer. "Philip Donovan," he said, dropping a file on Law's desk. "CEO of Meridian Pharmaceuticals. He's been Voss's shadow benefactor for 15 years. Law opened the file. Philip Donovan, 65, had built Meridian from a small research outfit into a pharmaceutical giant. His company had acquired or destroyed numerous competitors through methods that occasionally skirted legality, but never quite crossed the line into provable criminality. What's the connection to Voss? Voss was engaged to Donovan's daughter Catherine during graduate school. The engagement ended, but Donovan kept Voss in his orbit. I found a pattern. Wherever Voss worked, Meridian benefited from insider information. Law studied Donovan's photograph, distinguished, silver-haired, with cold eyes that reminded him uncomfortably of his own father. Donovan visited Voss in jail 3 times before the trial, Calvin continued, always as legal counsel to avoid recordings. The missing piece clicked into place. Voss hadn't been working alone. He'd been Donovan's proxy. The industrial espionage, the data theft from Boston General, it had all served Meridian's interests. Donovan let Voss take the fall, Law mused. Sacrificed him when he became a liability. Like a good chess player, Calvin agreed, knowing Law's fondness for the game. Law made his decision. I want everything on Donovan. Family, finances, weaknesses. You're not done, are you? Calvin asked quietly. Justice isn't complete, Law replied. The man who truly benefited from Russell's death is still free. The investigation into Philip Donovan consumed the next month. Law approached it methodically, building a comprehensive profile of the man who had manipulated Voss and indirectly caused Russell's death. The picture that emerged was of a brilliant but ruthless businessman who viewed people as assets to be used and discarded. His daughter Catherine had left the country after breaking her engagement to Voss, establishing a medical practice in Switzerland. His wife had died under mysterious circumstances 15 years earlier. His son Michael worked reluctantly in Meridian's legal department. Most importantly, Law discovered Donovan's vulnerability, an experimental treatment for early-onset Alzheimer's being developed in secret. Donovan had been diagnosed 3 years earlier, but had kept the condition hidden while pursuing aggressive treatment options, including using stolen research for Boston General's clinical trials. The final piece fell into place when Calvin uncovered communications between Donovan and Natalie dating back before her affair with Voss. She had been Donovan's inside person at the hospital before Voss re-entered the picture. She was playing both sides, Law realized, using Voss to cover her tracks with Donovan. With this knowledge, Law formulated a new plan, not for vengeance this time, but for justice. Philip Donovan needed to answer for his role in the conspiracy that had killed Russell. But unlike his previous campaign, Law would not operate in the shadows. This time, he would bring Donovan into the light. Chapter 8. The Reinforcement. Law's approach to Philip Donovan required a different strategy than he'd used with Voss and the others. Donovan was too powerful, too insulated to be destroyed through conventional means. We need leverage, Law told his team. But more importantly, we need public exposure. The plan centered around Donovan's hidden Alzheimer's diagnosis and the illegal means he'd employed to obtain treatment. If they could prove Meridian had stolen research and compromised clinical trials, the scandal would destroy both Donovan and his company. We need someone on the inside, Garrett observed. Law nodded. Michael Donovan, the son. Michael Donovan presented an opportunity, a reluctant participant in his father's empire, a man who had chosen law over medicine to please his father but harbored resentment over the direction of the company. Law arranged a seemingly chance meeting at a charity gala both were attending. As they discussed the pharmaceutical industry's ethical challenges, Law carefully steered the conversation toward Meridian's practices without revealing his true interest. The line between aggressive research and patient exploitation has become blurred, Michael commented, his tone suggesting personal concern. Law recognized an opening. Some would say Meridian crossed that line with the Alzheimer's trials. Michael stiffened slightly. What do you know about those trials? Enough to be concerned, Law replied, particularly about where the research originated. Their conversation ended with an agreement to meet again privately. Law had planted the seed. Now he needed to nurture it into full disclosure. Over the following weeks, Law cultivated a careful relationship with Michael, positioning himself as a potential ally rather than an adversary. He shared selective information about Voss's industrial espionage without revealing his personal connection to the case. The breakthrough came during their fourth meeting. My father is dying, Michael confided after several drinks. The treatments bought him time, but they're failing now. His mind is going, and he's becoming desperate. Desperate enough to compromise patient safety? Law asked carefully. Michael's silence was answer enough. I can help you stop him, Law offered. But I need evidence. The decision visibly weighed on Michael. Family loyalty battled with professional ethics. Finally, he nodded. Give me a week. 6 days later, Michael delivered a flash drive containing internal Meridian documents that confirmed everything. The theft of Boston General's research, the compromised clinical trials, and most damning, direct communication between Philip Donovan and Natalie Merritt establishing their arrangement before Voss became involved. What will you do with this? Michael asked, clearly conflicted. What should have been done months ago? Law replied. The truth needs to come out. Law's team verified the document's authenticity before proceeding. The evidence was irrefutable. Philip Donovan had orchestrated the entire operation, using Voss and Natalie as disposable pawns. When complications arose, he had abandoned them to their fate, protecting himself and Meridian from fallout. With the evidence secured, Law moved to Phase 2, reinforcing justice. First, he delivered comprehensive documentation to the FBI, SEC, and FDA simultaneously. The evidence detailed Meridian's criminal activities without revealing Law's personal connection or Michael's involvement. Next, he arranged for key documents to reach medical ethics boards and patient advocacy groups, ensuring the scandal couldn't be quietly handled through financial settlements. Finally, he contacted Catherine Donovan in Switzerland, sharing evidence of her father's criminal activities and the destruction left in his wake. Though they never spoke directly, her response came in the form of a statement to prosecutors, confirming what she had witnessed during her engagement to Voss. The Donovan empire began to crumble. Meridian's stock plummeted as federal investigations were announced. Clinical trials were suspended pending review. Philip Donovan was forced to step down as CEO while the board attempted damage control. Law watched the collapse from a distance, finding no satisfaction in Donovan's downfall, only a sense that the scales of justice were finally balancing. When federal agents arrived at Donovan's estate to execute search warrants, Law observed from his car across the street. The once powerful man who emerged between FBI agents appeared diminished, confused, his Alzheimer's symptoms apparently accelerating under stress. That evening, Law received an unexpected call from Detective Malone. "Voss is talking," Malone said without preamble, claiming Donovan was the mastermind all along. "Says your brother figured it out, and that's why he had to die. Is that going to help Voss?" Law asked, his voice neutral. "No, but it might extend Natalie's sentence." She knew more than she admitted. After they hung up, Law sat in silence, processing this final confirmation. The justice system was now addressing what his revenge had not, the full scope of responsibility for Russell's death. The next morning, Michael Donovan requested a meeting. They sat at a quiet corner table in an empty restaurant. "My father tried to kill himself last night," Michael said, his expression haunted. He left a confession. "It's comprehensive." Law absorbed this without visible reaction. "I'm sorry it came to this." Michael studied him. "You're not who I thought you were when we met. This wasn't just about corporate whistleblowing for you, was it?" "No," Law admitted. "But my reasons don't change the truth of what your father did." He mentioned someone named Russell in his confession. Said he authorized Voss to handle the problem when Russell threatened exposure. Law's composure nearly broke at hearing his brother's name. "Russell was my brother. Voss murdered him on your father's implicit authorization." Understanding dawned in Michael's eyes. "You orchestrated all of this. The investigations, the exposure. Justice needed reinforcement." Michael didn't argue the point. Instead, he asked, "What happens now?" "Now justice takes its course," Law replied. "Your father faces consequences for his actions. Meridian either reforms or dissolves. The people harmed by stolen research get answers. And you?" Michael pressed. "What do you get?" Law considered the question. "Closure," he finally said, though he wasn't certain he believed it. Chapter 9. The Foundation Stands. 1 year after Russell's murder, Law stood before his brother's grave. The cemetery was quiet in the early morning light, dew glistening on the granite headstone. "It's done," Law said softly. "All of them are paying for what they did to you." Philip Donovan had died awaiting trial, his Alzheimer's accelerated by stress and the cessation of experimental treatments. Meridian Pharmaceuticals had been dismantled, its legitimate assets sold to competitors, its tainted research discredited. Natalie, following additional charges related to her collaboration with Donovan, had received an extended sentence. She would be in her 60s before release. Law's parents remained incarcerated, their appeals denied. They had written to him several times, seeking forgiveness as their health declined in prison. Those letters remained unopened in his desk drawer. Justice had been served, comprehensive and uncompromising. Yet standing at Russell's grave, Law still felt incomplete. "You'd probably tell me to move on," he continued, placing a hand on the cool stone. "You always were better at that part." The wind rustled through nearby trees, a sound that had always brought Law peace at the lake house. He had finally decided to keep the property, renovating it to remove the stain of betrayal while preserving his grandfather's legacy. As he turned to leave, he noticed a woman standing nearby, mid-30s, professionally dressed, watching him with an uncertain expression. "Mr. Merritt," she said as he approached. "I'm Dr. Harper Browning." I worked with your brother at Mass General. Law vaguely recalled Russell mentioning a colleague named Harper. You were in the research department. She nodded. Russell and I were collaborating on something before he died. Something important. Law studied her, assessing. What kind of something? A treatment protocol for PTSD in combat veterans. Russell was passionate about it because of your military background. He said if we could help even one soldier suffer less than his brother had, it would be worth it. The revelation hit Law like a physical blow. He'd known Russell was working in psychiatric research, but hadn't known the focus had been inspired by him. I've continued the work, Harper explained. We're ready for clinical trials, but funding is an issue since the Donovan scandal. Many pharmaceutical companies are hesitant to back psychiatric research right now. Why are you telling me this? Because Russell believed in this project, and he believed in you. Before he died, he told me if we ever hit a wall, you were the one person who could break through it. He said you never gave up on anything that mattered. Law absorbed this, hearing his brother's voice in her words. Send the research to my office. I'll have my team review it. She handed him a business card. Thank you for considering it. Russell will be grateful. As she walked away, Law felt something shift inside him, the first stirring of purpose beyond vengeance. 2 weeks later, Law called a meeting with his executive team at Ironclad. Garrett, Diego, and Calvin listened intently as he outlined his proposal. I want to establish a foundation in Russell's name, he explained, focused on innovative PTSD treatments for veterans. We'll fund the research directly. No pharmaceutical partnerships. Garrett leaned forward. This is the project his colleague brought you? Law nodded. It's promising work. More importantly, it's what Russell cared about. Ironclad has the resources, Calvin confirmed. But this would be a significant pivot from our current operations. Not a pivot, Law corrected. An expansion. We'll continue our security contracts while developing the foundation. Many of our employees are veterans who could benefit directly from this research. The team discussed logistics, funding mechanisms, and organizational structure. By meeting's end, the Russell Merritt Foundation for Combat Trauma Research had taken preliminary shape. In the months that followed, Law threw himself into establishing the foundation with the same intensity he'd once directed toward vengeance. He recruited top researchers, secured facilities, and personally interviewed veterans willing to participate in trials. Dr. Harper Browning agreed to lead the research team, bringing Russell's original vision to the project. Her dedication matched Law's own, creating a partnership that gradually evolved beyond professional collaboration. One evening, as they reviewed preliminary results in Law's office, Harper asked the question others had avoided. Do you ever regret how things ended with them? Your wife, your parents. Law considered this carefully. I regret that they forced those endings. I regret Russell paid the price for their choices. But I don't regret ensuring they face consequences. That's not forgiveness, she observed. No, he agreed. Some betrayals can't be forgiven. Harper nodded, accepting his answer without judgment. Russell said you were the most principled person he'd ever known. Uncompromising in your convictions. Some would call that a flaw. Russell called it your foundation. He said when everything else crumbled, you would still be standing. The words resonated with unexpected power. Through all the destruction, the unraveling of his marriage, the loss of his family, the death of his brother, Law had indeed remained standing. Damaged but unbroken, his core principles intact. 2 years to the day after Russell's murder, Law returned to the lake house. The renovation was complete, erasing the physical reminders of betrayal while honoring the property's place in his family history. Garrett joined him on the dock, both men watching the sunset as they had many times before. The Foundation's first treatment protocol got FDA approval, Garrett noted. Russell would be proud. Law nodded, allowing himself to acknowledge the achievement. It's a start. You're never going to completely move on, are you? Garrett asked, not unkindly. No, Law admitted. But I'm moving forward. The distinction was important. Moving on implied forgetting, forgiving, releasing the past entirely. Law would never forgive those who had taken Russell from him, never forget their betrayal, never release them from accountability for their actions. But moving forward, that he could do, building something meaningful from the ruins of betrayal, honoring Russell's memory through work that mattered, finding purpose beyond vengeance. As darkness fell over the lake, Law made peace not with his enemies, but with himself. He had survived their best efforts to destroy him. He had ensured justice when the system might have failed. He had remained true to his nature, uncompromising, relentless, principled. The foundation of who he was remained unshaken. And on that foundation, he would build a future worthy of the brother he had lost. Not a future softened by forgiveness or weakened by compromise, but one strengthened by the unwavering conviction that had carried him through his darkest days. Some debts must be paid in full, some betrayals cannot be absolved, and true justice requires an unforgiving heart. Law Merritt would never be less than who he was, a man who did not forgive or forget, who exacted the full measure of consequence from those who betrayed him. That was his nature, his code, his foundation. And that foundation would stand. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there. Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. Perfect Life Hidden Cracks. Craig Cooper adjusted his tie in the hotel mirror, watching his wife Lori pack their suitcases with methodical precision. After 3 years of marriage, he still marveled at how organized she was. Every item folded perfectly, every detail planned. Their honeymoon anniversary trip to Paris had been her idea, complete with restaurant reservations and museum tickets booked months in advance. You know, most people would call this obsessive, Craig teased, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind. Lori laughed, that musical sound that had first caught his attention at a charity auction 4 years ago. Most people don't have a husband who forgets his passport until the last minute. Craig kissed her neck, breathing in her familiar jasmine perfume. At 35, he thought his bachelor days were behind him for good after his devastating divorce from his college sweetheart. Then Lori Guzman had walked into his architectural firm, claiming she needed someone to design her new art gallery. 6 months later, she'd moved in. A year after that, they were married. "I still can't believe you convinced me to take 2 weeks off," he said, releasing her to finish packing his own bag with considerably less care. "You've been working 18-hour days for months. The Morrison project will still be there when we get back." Lori zipped her suitcase shut with a satisfied smile. "Besides, when's the last time you did something just for fun?" Craig paused, realizing he couldn't remember. After his father's construction company collapsed 5 years ago, taking the family's reputation and life savings with it, Craig had thrown himself into building his architecture practice. Success had come, but at a cost. He'd isolated himself, trusted no one completely. Until Lori. She was different, patient, understanding. She never pushed about his past, never questioned why he kept certain friends at arm's length or why he sometimes worked late just to avoid going home to an empty apartment. When his mother had died 2 years ago, Lori had handled all the funeral arrangements without being asked. When his father's former business partner, Blake Root, had tried to muscle in on one of Craig's projects, Lori had been there with quiet support and practical advice. "You're thinking too hard again," Lori said, straightening his collar. "This is supposed to be a vacation, right? No work talk, no stress, just us and the city of light. And the city of love," she added with a grin that made his chest tight with affection. As they wheeled their luggage toward the door, Craig caught sight of their wedding photo on the dresser. He looked genuinely happy in it, happier than he'd been in years. Lori radiated joy beside him, her dark hair swept up, her smile brilliant. His family had been decimated by then, his mother fighting cancer, his father drinking himself to death with guilt over the business failure. But Lori had filled that void, created a new family for him. "Ready for our second first time in Paris?" she asked, using their private joke. They'd taken their honeymoon there, but spent most of it in their hotel room. More than ready. The taxi ride to LAX was comfortable, filled with Lori's excited chatter about the restaurant she'd researched and the art exhibitions they'd see. Craig found himself relaxing for the first time in months, already mentally disconnecting from the office emails piling up on his phone. They moved through check-in smoothly. Lori had already handled their seat assignments and upgraded them to business class as an anniversary surprise. At security, she handed him his boarding pass and passport with an efficient smile. "I don't deserve you," he said, meaning it. "No," she agreed playfully, "but you're stuck with me anyway." The security line moved quickly. Craig went through first, collecting his shoes and laptop bag on the other side. He turned to watch Lori approach the TSA checkpoint, her movements graceful even in the awkward shuffle of airport security. The agent was a middle-aged black man with kind eyes and steady hands. Joel Dillon, according to his name tag. He took Lori's passport with the bored efficiency of someone who'd done this thousands of times. Craig was putting on his shoes when he noticed Joel had stopped moving. The agent stared at his screen, then at Lori's passport, then back at the screen. His expression shifted from bored to confused to alarmed in the space of seconds. "Ma'am, I need you to step aside," Joel said, his voice carefully neutral. "Is there a problem?" Lori asked, and Craig heard something in her tone he'd never heard before, a slight tremor, quickly suppressed. "Just a routine secondary screening." "Sir," Joel called to Craig, "I need to speak with you." Craig approached the checkpoint, his stomach beginning to knot. "What's going on?" Joel's eyes flicked between Craig and Lori. Then he made a decision. "Sir, I need you to step over here, away from your wife." "What? What? Please, sir. Just for a moment." Craig looked back at Lori, who was being escorted to a separate area by another agent. She gave him what was probably meant to be a reassuring smile, but her face had gone pale. Joel led Craig to a corner near the checkpoint, out of earshot of other passengers. The agent's hand was shaking slightly as he pulled Craig aside. "Sir, I need to ask you something, and I need you to listen carefully. Are you traveling willingly with this woman?" "Of course I am. She's my wife." "What kind of question is that?" Joel glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. "Sir, do not get on this flight. Walk away and do not look back." Craig stared at him. "What are you talking about? I've been doing this job for 12 years. I've never seen anything like this. Whatever's going on here, it's beyond my pay grade. Way beyond. No one can help you if you get on that plane. You're not making any sense." "Help me with what?" Joel hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. He angled his screen so Craig could see it. "This is what came up when I scanned her passport." Craig looked at the screen and felt the world tilt beneath his feet. Red text filled the display. Interpol red notice. Armed and extremely dangerous. Do not approach. Contact federal authorities immediately. But it wasn't the text that made Craig's blood turn to ice. It was the photo staring back at him. Lori's face, but with different hair, different clothes, and a different name. Elena Kozlov, wanted for conspiracy, human trafficking, and multiple homicides. "That's impossible," Craig whispered. "This has to be a mistake." Joel's expression was grim with sympathy. "Sir, there's more. This passport she's carrying, it's a forgery. A good one, but still fake. Her real name is Elena Kozlov, and she's wanted by 3 different countries." Craig's mind reeled. 3 years of marriage. 3 years of sharing a bed, a home, a life. 3 years of trusting someone completely, and it had all been a lie. "How long has this been active?" he asked, his voice sounding strange and distant. "The notice? 7 years. The last update was..." Joel squinted at the screen. 6 months ago, someone added information about her being in the United States under the alias Lori Guzman. 6 months ago, right around the time they'd started planning this trip. Craig looked across the security area to where Lori, Elena, was waiting, and for just a moment her mask slipped. She was watching him with cold, calculating eyes, and when she saw him looking, her expression shifted back to concerned confusion so smoothly it was like watching a professional actress. "Sir," Joel said urgently, "whatever you're thinking, don't. Walk away. Let's handle this." But Craig was already thinking, his architect's mind beginning to process this information like any other complex problem. Someone had tipped off Interpol about Elena being in the U.S. Someone had been watching, waiting. And Elena, God, he couldn't think of her as Lori anymore. Had planned this trip as what? An escape route? A final score? Thank you, Craig said to Joel, his voice steadier than he felt. You may have just saved my life. As he walked back toward where Elena waited, Craig's mind was already working. She'd married him for a reason. People like her didn't do anything without a purpose. He'd been played, manipulated, used. But the game wasn't over yet. He was Craig Cooper, son of a man who'd built an empire from nothing before losing it all. He'd survived his father's fall, his mother's death, and clawed his way back to success through intelligence and determination. Elena Kozlov was about to learn that she'd chosen the wrong mark. Chapter 2. The Unraveling. Craig forced his expression into worried confusion as he approached Elena. Every step felt surreal. How many times had he walked toward his wife with love in his heart? Now he was walking toward a stranger wearing her face. What did he want? Elena asked, her voice pitched perfectly to convey concerned innocence. Something about routine security protocols, Craig replied, amazed at how steady his own voice sounded. They said it might be a few minutes. Elena nodded, but Craig caught the flash of calculation in her eyes before she looked down at her phone. She was typing rapidly. To whom? I'm going to use the restroom while we wait, Craig said. Good idea. This might take a while. Elena didn't look up from her phone. Craig walked toward the restrooms, but ducked into an alcove near a coffee stand instead. His hands were shaking as he called his business partner and closest friend, Wes Hopkins. Craig, aren't you supposed to be on a plane to Paris? Wes, I need you to listen carefully. Don't ask questions, just do exactly what I tell you. Go to my house right now. Check if anything's missing, documents, files, anything from my office. And Wes. Craig paused. Go armed. Jesus, Craig, what's happening? I can't explain now. Just, if Lori calls you, don't tell her I contacted you. In fact, don't answer her calls at all. Craig, please. I'll explain everything later. But right now, I need to know what she's taken. Craig hung up and immediately called his bank. It took several transfers and his full account information, but finally he reached someone who could check his accounts in real time. Mr. Cooper, all your accounts show normal activity. No unusual withdrawals or transfers. What about my wife? She's authorized on the accounts. Let me check. Yes, Mrs. Cooper made a wire transfer this morning for $50,000 to an account in the Cayman Islands. Craig closed his eyes. How long has she been authorized on my accounts? Since your marriage 3 years ago. She was added by your request. A request he barely remembered making during the whirlwind of combining their lives. How many other access points had he given her? I need to freeze all accounts immediately. My wife is not who I thought she was. Craig spent 10 precious minutes on security protocols, freezing assets, and changing passwords. When he returned to the security area, Elena was pacing, her phone pressed to her ear. I don't care what it takes, she was saying in a voice nothing like her usual warm tone. The timeline has moved up. We need to be gone before. She spotted Craig and immediately switched back to her concerned wife persona. Well, thank goodness, honey, you're back. I was just calling my gallery manager to let her know about the delay. Gallery manager, right? Craig realized he'd never actually met anyone from Elena's supposed art gallery. He'd never even been to the building she claimed to own. Joel caught Craig's eye from the checkpoint and nodded toward a side office. It was time. Ma'am, Joel called to Elena. We're ready for you now. Elena's phone buzzed with a text. Craig caught a glimpse of the message. Abort. They know. Exit Protocol 7. Elena read the message, and for just a split second, her mask dropped completely. The woman who looked back at Craig was someone he'd never seen before. Cold, professional, dangerous. Then the mask slipped back into place. Actually, Elena said with a bright smile, I just realized I left something in the car. Craig, honey, would you mind if we push the flight back? I know it's a hassle, but no problem at all, Craig said. Why don't you go get whatever you forgot? I'll handle rebooking our flights. Elena hesitated. This wasn't going according to whatever plan she had. You don't mind coming with me? I should probably stay here and deal with the airline. You know how these rebooking situations can be. Craig saw Joel positioning himself between Elena and the exit. Other security personnel were casually moving into position. Elena noticed too. On second thought, Elena said, her voice taking on a new edge, maybe we should just forget the whole trip. Forget it. Craig let confusion color his voice. But you've been planning this for months. You said it was our second honeymoon. Plans change. Elena was backing toward the exit now, and Craig could see the calculation in her movements. She was preparing to run. Elena, Craig said quietly. She froze. He'd used her real name. I think we need to talk. Elena's hand moved to her purse, and Craig saw Joel tense. How many weapons was she carrying? How many people had she hurt? I don't know what you think you know, Elena said, her voice now carrying a slight accent Craig had never heard before. Russian, maybe. I know enough. Craig stepped closer, keeping his voice low. I know about the red notice. I know about the wire transfer this morning. I know Lori Guzman doesn't exist. Elena's laugh was nothing like Lori's musical sound. This was harsh, calculating. You know nothing, Craig Cooper. You never did. Then tell me. Tell me why you married me. Tell me what this was all about. This? Elena gestured between them. This was business. Nothing more. The words hit Craig like physical blows, but he kept his expression steady. What kind of business? Elena glanced around the security area, weighing her options. Joel and his team were closing in, but she still had space to move. Your father, she said finally, destroyed a lot of people when his company collapsed. People who had invested everything. People who lost their homes, their life savings. Craig's blood chilled. What does my father have to do with this? Everyt was one of those investors. Did you know that? He put $2 million into Cooper Construction, money that belonged to some very dangerous people. When your father's Ponzi scheme collapsed, Blake had to find other ways to pay his debts. My father didn't run a Ponzi scheme. The business failed because of the housing market crash. Elena's smile was predatory. Is that what you told yourself? Poor Craig, so naive. Your father was stealing from Peter to pay Paul for years. Everyt has the evidence to prove it. The world seemed to tilt. Craig had rebuilt his entire life on the foundation that his father was an honest man destroyed by circumstances beyond his control. You're lying. Am I? Ask yourself why Everyt keeps trying to work with you. Why he's so interested in your projects. He's been waiting for the right moment to collect on your father's debt. With interest. And where do you fit in? I was supposed to get close to you, learn about your assets, your business connections. Make sure you were worth Blake's patience. Elena's voice was matter-of-fact, as if discussing the weather. The marriage was thorough research. Craig felt something break inside him, but he kept it off his face. And now the timeline has accelerated. Blake needs his money immediately, and you're going to provide it, one way or another. Joel was within 10 feet now, speaking quietly into his radio. Elena saw him and made her decision. You should have gotten on that plane, Craig. It would have been easier for everyone. She moved fast, her hand coming out of her purse with something small and dark. But Craig was faster, his architect's spatial awareness allowing him to predict her movement. He grabbed her wrist as she brought up what looked like a small pistol. Gun! Joel shouted, and suddenly the security area exploded into motion. Elena twisted in Craig's grip with professional efficiency. But Craig had spent years working construction sites with his father. He was stronger than he looked. They struggled for a moment before Joel and two other agents reached them. Elena went limp suddenly, but Craig didn't release her wrist. He'd seen that trick in movies. Smart, Elena said as the TSA agents cuffed her. Maybe you're not as naive as I thought. As I led her away, Elena looked back at Craig one more time. Everyt is still out there, Craig. And he's not going to stop just because I'm in custody. You cost him his best asset. That makes you an even bigger problem than before. Craig watched his wife, his fake wife, disappear into TSA custody and try to process what had just happened. 3 years of his life had been a lie. Every kiss, every shared meal, every intimate moment. All carefully orchestrated manipulation. His phone buzzed. Wes. Craig, you need to get home. Now. Your house has been torn apart, and someone's been through every file in your home office. Also, Wes paused. There's someone here who says he needs to talk to you about Everyt. Says his name is Jimmy Quinn and that you're in serious danger. Craig looked around the airport security area, suddenly aware that Elena might not have been working alone. How many other people were watching him right now? "I'm on my way," he said. "And Wes, make sure Quinn is who he says he is before you let your guard down." As Craig walked back through the airport toward the exit, he realized his old life was over. The question now was whether he'd survive long enough to build a new one. Chapter 3. The Truth About Blake Root. Craig's hands gripped the steering wheel as he navigated Los Angeles traffic, his mind racing faster than his Honda Accord could carry him home. Every few minutes, he caught himself checking the rearview mirror, looking for signs of pursuit. Elena's warning echoed in his head. Blake Root is still out there. The drive from LAX to his Pasadena home normally took 40 minutes. Craig made it in 28, running 2 red lights and taking shortcuts through residential neighborhoods. When he pulled into his driveway, he immediately noticed Wes's pickup truck and an unfamiliar black sedan parked on the street. The front door was unlocked. Craig walked in to find his living room destroyed, couch cushions slashed open, bookcases emptied, even the floorboards pried up in places. This wasn't random burglary. This was a systematic search. "Craig," Wes's voice called from the kitchen. Craig found his business partner sitting at the kitchen table across from a man he'd never seen before. The stranger was maybe 50, with graying hair and the kind of lean, alert posture that screamed law enforcement or military. He wore a simple black suit and had hard eyes that evaluated Craig from head to toe as he entered the room. "Craig Cooper," the stranger said, rising to offer his hand. "Jimmy Quinn, FBI Financial Crimes Division. We need to talk." Craig shook the offered hand cautiously. "How do I know you're really FBI?" Quinn smiled grimly and produced his credentials. They looked authentic, but Craig had just discovered his wife was a master forger. "Fair question, considering what you've been through today. TSA alerted us when they arrested Elena Kozlov. We've been tracking her for 18 months. 18 months. Craig sank into a chair. "She's been under surveillance for 18 months, and you didn't warn me?" "We weren't sure what your involvement was," Quinn said bluntly. "Elena Kozlov is a world-class grifter. She's been married 7 times under different identities. Usually, the husbands are complicit. Usually, 3 of her previous husbands died in accidents after transferring significant assets to offshore accounts. 2 more are serving time for crimes they probably didn't commit. We had to be sure you weren't another willing accomplice." Wes leaned forward. "Craig, this guy knows things about Blake Root that you need to hear." Quinn opened a file folder on the table. "Blake Root isn't just a failed businessman trying to recoup losses from your father's company. He's been running a sophisticated money laundering operation for Eastern European crime syndicates for over a decade." Craig stared at the documents Quinn spread across the table. Bank records, wire transfers, surveillance photos. "That's impossible. Blake's been working construction in Los Angeles for 20 years. His construction business is legitimate," Quinn agreed. "It's also the perfect front for moving dirty money. He inflates project costs, creates fictional subcontractors, bills for materials that don't exist. Last year alone, he washed over $40 million through his various companies." "What does this have to do with my father?" Quinn pulled out another document, a bank statement from Cooper Construction dating back 6 years. "Your father discovered Blake's operation by accident. He was doing a joint project with Root Development and noticed discrepancies in their billing. Being an honest man, he threatened to report it." Craig's stomach dropped. "And Blake couldn't risk exposure, so he destroyed your father's company instead. The housing market crash provided perfect cover. He manipulated your father's loans, called in debts early, even bribed building inspectors to delay permits on crucial projects." Wes whistled low. "Jesus. Your father never ran a Ponzi scheme," Quinn continued. "Blake Root systematically dismantled Cooper Construction to protect his money laundering operation. Your father died thinking he was a failure, never knowing he'd been targeted for being too honest." Craig felt anger building in his chest, hot and clean. His father had spent his last 2 years drowning in guilt and alcohol, convinced he destroyed his family's legacy through poor business decisions. The truth was so much worse. "Elena told me Blake needed money immediately," Craig said. "Why now?" His Eastern European partners are losing patience. They've had some major busts in the past year. Lost shipments, arrested associates. They're demanding their money back with interest. Blake's desperate, so he sent Elena to marry me and steal everything I have. More complicated than that. Quinn pulled out a surveillance photo of Craig and Elena at their wedding. Elena's specialty isn't just theft, it's elimination. Our analysis suggests Blake intended for Elena to marry you, transfer your assets, then arrange for your death to look like suicide. The grieving widow would inherit everything and disappear. The room fell silent. Craig stared at his wedding photo, remembering how happy he'd felt that day. How grateful he'd been to find love again. Something changed the timeline, Quinn continued. We think Blake's partners gave him an ultimatum. Instead of the slow burn they'd planned, they needed immediate results. That's why Elena tried to get me on the plane to Paris, Craig realized. What was supposed to happen there? Paris has no extradition treaties with 3 countries where Elena has active warrants. Our guess is you would have had an accident within the first few days. Elena would have claimed your body and inherited everything as your widow. Wes stood up abruptly and walked to the window. This is insane. We're talking about professional killers. Which brings us to your current problem, Quinn said. Elena's in federal custody, but Blake still needs that money. With his primary asset compromised, he's going to have to improvise. Meaning he's probably going to try to kill you directly and forge documents to access your accounts. Quinn's voice was matter-of-fact. Or kidnap you and force you to transfer the funds yourself. Craig looked around his destroyed living room. They've already been here. This wasn't Blake's people, Quinn said. This was Elena's backup plan. She had partners here in LA, probably Russian mob connections. When she missed her check-in, they came looking for anything that might help them complete the job. Great. So I have both Blake Root and the Russian mob after me. It gets worse, Quinn said grimly. Blake knows we're onto him now. That makes him unpredictable. Desperate criminals make poor decisions, which makes them dangerous to everyone around them. Craig stood up and began pacing. So what are my options? Witness protection. We can't guarantee your safety in witness protection if Blake has mob connections. These people are patient and well-funded. Then what? Quinn closed his file folder. Honestly, your best chance is to help us bring Blake down. We've been building a case against him for 3 years, but we need someone on the inside. Inside, Wes turned from the window. You want Craig to go undercover? Blake's been trying to work with Craig for months, right? Ever since Elena reported back that Craig was a viable target. If Craig approached Blake now, claiming Elena had cheated him out of money and he wanted revenge, you want me to pretend to be a bitter ex-husband looking for payback? Craig said, Blake respects money and ruthlessness. If you convinced him you wanted to partner with him against Elena, maybe even help him access her hidden assets, that's insane, Wes said. Craig's an architect, not an undercover agent. Quinn looked at Craig carefully. What do you think? Craig was quiet for a long moment, thinking Blake Root had destroyed his father, corrupted his marriage, and tried to have him killed. The conventional approach would be to hide, let the FBI handle it, hope for the best. But Craig had been running and hiding since his father's business collapsed. He'd built his new life carefully, quietly, trying not to attract attention. That approach had made him the perfect target. What I need to do? Craig asked. Craig, Wes protested. Blake's expecting you to be devastated, confused, probably seeking answers, Quinn said. If you approached him claiming Elena had stolen money from you and you wanted help getting it back, he'd see an opportunity to manipulate me again. Exactly. We'd wire you up, get you into Blake's operation. Once we have evidence of his money laundering activities, you'd have enough to put him away. Quinn nodded. Life in federal prison, minimum, and his mob partners would be too busy covering their own assets to worry about revenge. Craig looked around his destroyed home one more time. Every photo had been pulled from its frame, every drawer emptied. They'd even torn up the floorboards where he kept his father's old business files. His father had tried to do the right thing and been destroyed for it. Craig had tried to build a quiet, successful life and been targeted for it. Maybe it was time to try a different approach. What do I need to know about Blake Root? Craig asked. Quinn smiled grimly and reopened his file folder. Everything. Chapter 4. The Devil's Details. The FBI safe house in Glendale was a nondescript two-bedroom ranch that looked like every other house on the block. For the past 2 days, Craig had been living there while Quinn and his team prepared him for what they were calling Operation Payback. Blake Root is paranoid, but he's also greedy, Quinn explained as they went over surveillance photos for the 10th time. That combination makes him predictable in some ways, dangerous in others. Craig studied a photo of Blake taken outside his Beverly Hills office building. Even in the grainy surveillance image, Blake looked exactly as Craig remembered, tall, silver-haired, with the kind of commanding presence that made people trust him with their money. The perfect con man's facade. His weakness is that he believes everyone else is as corrupt as he is, Quinn continued. When you approach him, he won't be suspicious of your motives. He'll be calculating how to use you. And if he realizes I'm working with you, then you'll probably end up like Elena's previous husbands, Quinn said bluntly. Which is why this plan has to be perfect. Craig's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Mr. Cooper, this is Blake Root's assistant. Mr. Root would like to meet with you today at 2 p.m. to discuss a business opportunity. Please confirm. Quinn grinned. He's taking the bait. They'd spent yesterday setting the hook. Craig had made several carefully placed phone calls, ostensibly to friends, but actually to people Quinn knew would pass information to Blake's network. The story was simple. Craig Cooper's wife had cleaned out his accounts and disappeared, leaving him financially ruined and furious. Remember, Quinn said as they did a final equipment check, Blake's office is likely equipped with surveillance detection equipment. The wire we're using is state-of-the-art, but if he sweeps you... I know. Stay calm, stick to the story, and remember that my life depends on selling this performance. Craig looked at himself in the bathroom mirror. He'd deliberately skipped shaving and had been living on coffee and stress for 2 days. He looked exactly like a man whose world had fallen apart, which, in many ways, he was. The recording device was a tiny chip sewn into the collar of his shirt, barely larger than a button. Quinn assured him it was undetectable, but Craig felt like it was glowing like a neon sign. Craig, Quinn said as they prepared to leave, if at any point you feel like you're in immediate danger, just say the phrase, I need to call my lawyer. We'll be listening, and we'll come in immediately. And if Blake decides to kill me before I can say anything, then this plan was a mistake, and I'll spend the rest of my career feeling guilty about it. Craig appreciated the honesty, if not the sentiment. Blake Root's office was on the 15th floor of a Century City high-rise, all glass and chrome and expensive views. His receptionist, a young blonde who looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine, escorted Craig to an office that probably cost more to furnish than most people made in a year. Blake rose from behind a mahogany desk the size of a small car, his smile perfectly calibrated to convey sympathy and opportunity in equal measure. Craig, my boy, you look terrible. I heard about what happened with Lori. I'm so sorry. Blake's handshake lingered just a moment too long, and Craig caught him glancing toward a small device on his desk that was probably recording their conversation. Thank you for seeing me, Blake. I wasn't sure who else to turn to. Sit. Can Monica get you anything? Coffee? Something stronger. Craig took the offered chair, noting that it was positioned so Blake could see his hands at all times. Coffee would be great. While Monica prepared coffee from an elaborate machine in the corner, Blake settled back behind his desk with the practiced ease of a man conducting a job interview. So, Blake said once they were alone, tell me what really happened. Craig had rehearsed this story dozens of times, but now, sitting across from a man who destroyed his father, it took all his self-control to keep his voice steady. Lori cleaned out our joint accounts 2 days ago. $50,000 transferred to some offshore account. When I confronted her at the airport, she laughed and told me it was all a game, that I was just a mark. At the airport, she was trying to get me on a flight to Paris. Said it was our anniversary trip. Craig let bitterness creep into his voice. Turns out she had a different kind of trip planned. Blake leaned forward with apparent interest. What do you mean? The TSA agent showed me her passport. Her real passport. Lori Guzman doesn't exist. Her name is Elena, something Russian. She's wanted by Interpol. Elena Kozlov, Blake said quietly. Craig looked up sharply. You know her? Blake was quiet for a moment, clearly calculating. I know of her. She's a specialist. A specialist in what? Acquiring assets from wealthy individuals. Blake's tone was carefully neutral. I may have used her services once or twice in the past. The admission hit Craig like a physical blow. Blake wasn't even pretending to be innocent. You hired her to rob me? Rob is such an ugly word, Blake said smoothly. I hired her to collect on a debt. What debt? Blake stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the Los Angeles skyline. Your father cost me a great deal of money, Craig. $2 million to be exact. Money that belonged to some very unforgiving people. Craig forced himself to sound confused rather than angry. My father's business failed because of the housing crash. That wasn't his fault. Your father's business failed because he threatened to expose my operation to federal authorities, Blake said calmly. I couldn't allow that to happen. The casual admission of guilt was stunning. Blake was confessing to destroying Cooper Construction like he was discussing the weather. So you decided to destroy his company? I decided to protect my interests. Your father was collateral damage. Craig gripped the arms of his chair. He died thinking he was a failure. He died being a failure. The only difference is that I helped him along. Blake turned back to Craig with something that might have been sympathy. But that's the past. The question now is what we do about the future. What do you mean? Blake returned to his desk and opened a file folder. Elena Kozlov is in federal custody, which means she won't be returning the money she stole from you. Or from me, for that matter. She stole from you too? Elena was supposed to deliver your assets to me as partial payment on your father's debt. Instead, she appears to have decided to retire on her own terms. Blake's smile was cold. That leaves both of us out our money. Craig could hardly believe what he was hearing. Blake was openly admitting to conspiracy, theft, and worse. What are you proposing? Elena Kozlov has been very successful over the years. Our intelligence suggests she has at least $10 million hidden in various offshore accounts. Blake leaned forward. If we could access those accounts, you're the aggrieved husband. You have legal standing to claim her assets as part of a divorce settlement. With the right legal maneuvering and the right pressure applied in the right places, we could recover everything she's stolen. From both of us. Craig pretended to consider this. What kind of pressure? Elena has partners. Associates who helped her with her various projects. People who know where her money is hidden. Blake's tone turned businesslike. Some of those people are currently in situations where they might be persuaded to cooperate. You're talking about threatening people. I'm talking about recovering stolen assets through aggressive negotiation. The euphemism was chilling. Craig realized Blake was proposing to torture information out of Elena's associates. I'm not sure I'm comfortable with. Craig, Blake interrupted, his voice taking on a harder edge. Elena Kozlov played you for a fool, stole your money, and probably planned to kill you once she drained your accounts. Comfort is a luxury you can't afford. Blake opened his desk drawer and pulled out a manila envelope. These are photographs from Elena's previous marriages. Take a look. Craig opened the envelope and immediately wished he hadn't. The photos showed crime scenes, bodies, blood, police tape. Elena's previous husbands. She's killed before, Blake said unnecessarily. The only reason you're alive is that we interrupted her timeline. Do you really want to show her mercy? Craig stared at the photographs, genuine revulsion making his performance easier. How do we find her associates? Blake smiled, and Craig saw the predator beneath the businessman's facade. Leave that to me. The question is, are you prepared to do whatever it takes to get your money back? Craig met Blake's eyes. Whatever it takes. Excellent. Blake closed the envelope and returned it to his drawer. I think this is the beginning of a very profitable partnership. As Craig left Blake's office 20 minutes later, his head was spinning. Blake had not only confessed to destroying Cooper Construction, he'd outlined a plan that involved kidnapping and torturing Elena's associates. The wire had captured everything. But as Craig walked to his car, he realized the most terrifying part of the meeting wasn't Blake's casual admission of guilt. It was how convincing Craig had found his own performance as a man willing to commit torture for money. Maybe he wasn't as different from Blake Root as he'd thought. Chapter 5. into the darkness. The abandoned warehouse in San Pedro looked like 1,000 others scattered across Los Angeles's industrial landscape. Rusted corrugated metal, broken windows, weeds growing through cracked asphalt. Craig wouldn't have given it a second glance if Blake hadn't specifically directed him here. "Are you getting this?" Craig whispered, his lips barely moving as he spoke to the wire in his collar. Quinn's voice came through the tiny earpiece hidden in Craig's ear canal. Crystal clear. "Remember, if things go south, we're 30 seconds away." Craig had spent the past week deeper undercover than Quinn's team had originally planned. Blake had been impressed by Craig's apparent willingness to pursue Elena's associates and had invited him into increasingly serious criminal discussions. The FBI was getting everything they needed to build their case, but the psychological toll on Craig was mounting. "You're going to see some things today that might disturb you," Blake had warned him that morning. Elena's partners aren't the type to respond to polite requests for information. Now, as Craig approached the warehouse, he understood what Blake had meant. 2 black SUVs were parked outside, and Craig could see men in suits stationed at various points around the building. This wasn't a negotiation. It was an interrogation. Blake emerged from the warehouse with his usual commanding smile. But Craig noticed he was wearing clothes he could afford to throw away. "Right on time. Come on, there's someone I want you to meet." Inside the warehouse, Craig's eyes adjusted to reveal a scene from his nightmares. A man was zip-tied to a chair in the center of the concrete floor, his face bloodied and swollen. Around him, 3 men in expensive suits were examining what looked like a toolbox full of implements Craig didn't want to identify. "Craig Cooper," Blake said conversationally. "Meet Kelvin Maloney. Kelvin used to work with Elena on her various projects." The man in the chair looked up at Craig with eyes full of pain and desperation. "Please," he said in accented English. "I already told them everything I know." Blake gestured to one of his associates, a man Craig now knew was named Arturo Farley. "Arturo, would you bring Mr. Maloney up to speed on what we've learned so far?" Arturo consulted a tablet. "Kelvin here confirms that Elena has been operating in Los Angeles for the past 4 years under the Lori Guzman identity. He helped her establish bank accounts, credit history, even the art gallery that served as her cover story." Craig felt sick. The art gallery he'd helped her design had been completely fictional. But, Blake continued, his voice hardening, "Kelvin claims he doesn't know where Elena keeps her primary assets, which I find difficult to believe." "I swear on my mother's grave," Kelvin said desperately, "Elena never told any of us about the big money. We only handled the small stuff, the cover stories, the false identities." Blake nodded to another associate, a younger man who looked like he enjoyed his work too much. The man picked up what looked like a car battery with cables attached. "Craig," Blake said, "I want you to understand something. In my business, trust is earned through shared experience. What you're about to witness is how we earn trust." Quinn's voice was urgent in Craig's earpiece. "Get out of there. Now, say the code phrase." But Craig couldn't move. If he left now, Blake would know he was working with the FBI. Everything they'd worked for would be lost, and Blake would disappear into the criminal underground where they'd never find him. "Understand," Craig heard himself say. The young man with the battery approached Kelvin, who began pleading in what sounded like Russian. Craig forced himself to watch, knowing that his reaction would determine whether Blake trusted him. What followed was the longest 10 minutes of Craig's life. The systematic application of pain to extract information was worse than anything he'd seen in movies. But what disturbed Craig most was how methodical it was. These men had clearly done this before. Finally, Kelvin broke. "Geneva," he screamed. "Swiss account 847-7934-2847. The password is Moscow Nights. Please, no more." Blake smiled with satisfaction. "See how easy that was? Kelvin, you could have saved us all a lot of time." Arturo was already on his phone, presumably having someone check the account information. After a few minutes, he nodded to Blake. "4.7 million, Arturo reported. "Account's been active for 6 months. "Excellent." Blake turned to Craig. "Your wife was busier than we thought." Craig stared at Kelvin, who was sobbing with relief and pain. "What happens to him now?" "That depends," Blake said, on whether there's anything else he hasn't told us. Over the next hour, they extracted information about 2 more accounts and the locations of several safe deposit boxes Elena had established around the city. By the time they were finished, Kelvin had given them access to over $12 million. This is just the beginning, Blake told Craig as they walked back toward the warehouse entrance. Elena has been working for 7 years. This can't be all of it. What about him? Craig nodded back toward Kelvin. He's outlived his usefulness. Craig's blood turned to ice. You're going to kill him? He's seen all of us. He knows too much about our operation. Blake's voice was matter-of-fact. Don't worry, it'll be quick. Blake, he gave us everything we wanted. Killing him seems what? Unprofessional. Blake stopped walking and studied Craig's face. I need to know that you understand the stakes here, Craig. This isn't a game. Elena's partners, the people we're going after, they won't hesitate to kill you if they get the chance. If you're squeamish about necessary business practices. Craig forced his voice to remain steady. I'm not squeamish. I'm practical. Dead bodies attract police attention. Blake's expression relaxed slightly. That's true. Arturo, make sure the body disappears completely. No traces. As they walked to their cars, Craig felt like he was walking through hell. In his earpiece, Quinn was giving him continuous reassurance that backup was ready to move in, but Craig knew that if he called for help now, Kelvin would die before the FBI could save him. There's one more thing, Blake said as they reached Craig's car. We've identified Elena's primary partner. Her handler, you might say. Someone who's been coordinating her activities for years. Who? Stanley Ferguson. He runs a legitimate shipping business, but it's a front for moving people and money for Eastern European syndicates. Blake handed Craig a photograph. We're going to pay him a visit tomorrow night. Craig looked at the photo. Ferguson looked like a grandfather. Gray hair, kind eyes, the type of man you'd trust to watch your children. Ferguson knows where Elena keeps her primary assets, Blake continued. The real money. But he's not going to be as easy to break as Kelvin. Why not? Blake's smile was cold. Because Stanley Ferguson used to be KGB. Old school. He's been trained to resist interrogation. As Craig drove away from the warehouse, his hands shaking on the steering wheel, Quinn's voice was constant in his earpiece. You did great, Craig. We got everything we need to put Blake away forever. But Craig wasn't thinking about the FBI's case anymore. He was thinking about Kelvin Maloney, who was probably dead by now. He was thinking about Stanley Ferguson, who would be tortured tomorrow night. He was thinking about how easily he'd stood there and watched a man be brutalized for information. Most of all, he was thinking about how Blake had looked at him with approval, as if Craig was finally becoming the kind of man Blake could respect. The worst part was that some small, dark corner of Craig's mind had felt pride in that approval. Chapter 6. The Point of No Return. Craig stood in his bathroom at 3 a.m., staring at his reflection and trying to wash the smell of the warehouse from his skin. No matter how hot he made the water, he couldn't get clean. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Kelvin Maloney's face, heard his screams. Quinn had called an emergency meeting at the safe house. When Craig arrived, he found the FBI agent pacing the kitchen, his usually calm demeanor cracked with tension. We have a problem, Quinn said without preamble. Stanley Ferguson is an undercover DEA agent. Craig felt the world tilt beneath his feet. What? Ferguson's been deep undercover for 3 years, infiltrating the same Eastern European network that Elena works for. If Blake tortures him, Blake will discover he's law enforcement, and that will lead Blake directly back to you. Quinn ran his hands through his hair. We have to pull you out. Tonight. What about Ferguson? We'll warn him. Get him to safety before Blake can make his move. Craig sat down heavily at the kitchen table. And Blake, we'll have to settle for what we've got. The recordings from today should be enough to convict him on conspiracy and money laundering charges. Should be. Quinn's expression was grim. Blake's smart. He never explicitly ordered Kelvin's murder on tape. A good lawyer might argue that Blake was just questioning a theft suspect and things got out of hand. Craig stared at the FBI agent. You're telling me that after everything, after watching Kelvin get tortured, after putting my life on the line for a week, Blake might walk free? He'll serve time, Quinn said defensively. Maybe 10 years. 10 years. and then he's free to go back to destroying people's lives. Craig, I understand your frustration, but no. Craig stood up, his voice harder than he'd ever heard it. You don't understand. Everyt destroyed my father. He killed my marriage. He was planning to have me murdered. And you want to let him bargain his way to a 10-year sentence. What are you suggesting? Craig was quiet for a long moment, his mind racing. Blake expected him to participate in torturing Stanley Ferguson tomorrow night. What if Ferguson wasn't warned? What if Blake discovered Ferguson was DEA during the interrogation? What would happen if Blake killed a federal agent? Craig asked quietly. Quinn stared at him. That would be a capital crime. Life in prison minimum. Probably death penalty. And if it happened while I was wearing a wire. Craig, you're not seriously suggesting. I'm suggesting that maybe we let Blake hang himself. Craig's voice was steady now, his architect's mind working through the problem like any other structural challenge. Ferguson is trained to resist interrogation, right? Former KGB. Yes, but so he can hold out long enough for us to get what we need on tape. Blake ordering a federal agent's murder, maybe even doing it himself. Quinn looked horrified. You're talking about letting a DEA agent be tortured to build our case. I'm talking about stopping Everyt permanently. Craig met Quinn's eyes. Ferguson knew the risks when he went undercover. Kelvin Maloney was just trying to make a living, and he's probably dead right now because I stood there and watched. Craig, listen to yourself. You're talking like what? Like Blake. Craig smiled grimly. Maybe that's what it takes to beat him. Maybe you have to be willing to go as far as he is. Quinn stood up abruptly. This conversation is over. I'm pulling you out tonight, and we're warning Ferguson immediately. And Blake escapes justice. Again, Blake will be arrested and prosecuted to the full extent of the law. For 10 years, while Elena's other victims stay dead, and Blake's mob partners move on to the next money launderer. Craig shook his head. I won't let that happen. You don't have a choice. This operation is officially terminated. Craig looked at Quinn for a long moment, then stood and walked toward the door. Where are you going? Home, Craig said. To pack. Like you ordered. But Craig didn't go home. Instead, he drove to a 24-hour diner in Hollywood and sat in a corner booth, drinking coffee and thinking. By dawn, he'd made his decision. At 9 a.m., he called Blake. I've been thinking about Ferguson, Craig said when Blake answered. You're right. Someone with KGB training won't break easily. No, he won't. That's why I'm bringing in some specialists. Russians who know how the old Soviet methods work. Craig felt his stomach clench, but kept his voice steady. I want to be there. Craig, what we're going to do to Ferguson, it's going to be worse than what happened to Kelvin. Much worse. I understand. Elena destroyed my life. Blake. Ferguson was part of that. I want to look him in the eye when he tells us where she hid the money. Blake was quiet for a moment. You've changed, Craig. A week ago, you were a soft architect who'd never hurt anyone. Now I understand what it takes to survive in your world. Yes, Blake said with obvious satisfaction. Yes, you do. Ferguson won't know what hit him. That evening, Craig drove to the new location Blake had specified, another warehouse, this one in Long Beach. But this time, he wasn't wearing an FBI wire. He disabled his phone and left it at home. As far as Quinn knew, Craig had gone aground and was preparing to flee Los Angeles. Blake was already at the warehouse when Craig arrived, along with Arturo and 3 men Craig didn't recognize. The new men looked like they'd stepped out of a Moscow back alley. Hard faces, expensive track suits, and the kind of casual brutality that didn't need to advertise itself. Craig, meet Dmitri and his associates, Blake said. They're going to help us have a conversation with Mr. Ferguson. The Russians looked Craig up and down with professional interest. One of them said something in Russian that made the others laugh. He says you don't look like muscle. Blake translated. I told him looks can be deceiving. Stanley Ferguson was brought in 20 minutes later, zip-tied and blindfolded, but not yet beaten. When they removed the blindfold, Craig saw intelligent eyes that immediately began cataloging faces and details. Ferguson was building a mental case file even as they prepared to torture him. Gentlemen, Blake said formally, meet Stanley Ferguson. Mr. Ferguson has been coordinating Elena Kozlov's activities for the past several years, and he's going to tell us where she keeps her money. Ferguson's eyes settled on Craig. Craig felt a stab of something: anger, embarrassment, pain. Elena's usual type ends up dead. Yes, they do. Ferguson's voice was calm, almost conversational. But you're still breathing. That makes you special. Blake nodded to Dimitri, who began unpacking a case of instruments that made the previous night's tools look primitive. Mr. Ferguson, Blake continued, I'm going to be direct. Elena Kozlov has at least $50 million hidden in various accounts. You're going to tell us how to access those accounts. Ferguson smiled. Or what? You'll torture me? He looked around the warehouse. I was interrogated by the KGB for 6 months in 1987. Your Russian friends here learned from my former colleagues. This should be interesting. Dimitri said something to Blake in Russian. Blake nodded. Dimitri says Ferguson is trying to establish psychological dominance through false confidence. It's a classic resistance technique. Let him try, Ferguson said calmly. I have all night. As Dimitri approached Ferguson with the first of his tools, Craig realized he'd made a terrible mistake. Ferguson wasn't just going to be tortured. He was going to be tortured by experts who enjoyed their work. And Craig was going to have to watch every second of it to maintain his cover. But it was too late to back out now. Blake was watching him carefully, evaluating his reactions. The slightest sign of weakness would blow Craig's cover and probably get him killed. As Dimitri began his work and Ferguson's screams echoed off the warehouse walls, Craig forced himself to watch. He cataloged every detail, memorized every face, recorded every confession Blake made while Ferguson was being broken. Because Craig had realized something during his sleepless night. He didn't need the FBI to get justice for his father. He just needed evidence. And by the time this night was over, he'd have enough evidence to destroy Blake Root completely, even if it destroyed Craig in the process. Chapter 7. The Trap Springs. 3 hours into Ferguson's interrogation, Craig finally understood why the DEA agent had lasted so long undercover. Even as Dimitri applied increasingly sophisticated torture techniques, Ferguson revealed information in calculated doses, enough to seem broken, but never quite enough to satisfy Blake's suspicions. He's playing with us, Blake muttered to Craig as Dimitri took a break to examine his tools. Ferguson's giving us account numbers that probably don't exist. How can you tell? Look at his eyes. He's still calculating, still thinking 3 moves ahead. Blake's voice took on a dangerous edge. Dimitri's about to escalate to permanent damage. If Ferguson doesn't start talking soon. Craig watched Ferguson, noting how the agent maintained eye contact despite his obvious pain. Ferguson was buying time, but for what? Did he somehow know the FBI was coming? That's when Craig realized Quinn hadn't given up on the operation. The FBI was probably surrounding the warehouse right now, waiting for the right moment to move in. All of Ferguson's resistance, all of his careful distribution of information, was designed to keep Blake talking long enough for backup to arrive. Which meant Craig was about to be caught in the middle of a federal raid, while deep undercover with no way to identify himself as an asset. Blake, Craig said carefully, maybe we should move this somewhere more secure. If Ferguson was important enough for the DEA to place undercover. The DEA? Blake spun around to stare at Craig. Craig realized his mistake immediately. He'd revealed knowledge he shouldn't have. I assumed, given how well trained he obviously is. Blake's eyes narrowed. How did you know Ferguson was DEA, Craig? The warehouse fell silent except for Ferguson's labored breathing. Arturo and the Russians were all staring at Craig now, their hands moving toward concealed weapons. Craig's mind raced. He could try to bluff, claim he'd made a lucky guess. But Blake was too smart, too paranoid. The moment of truth had arrived. I think, Blake said quietly, we need to have a different conversation. That's when Ferguson spoke up, his voice hoarse but clear, because Agent Craig Cooper has been working with the FBI for the past 2 weeks. The warehouse exploded into motion. Arturo drew a gun and pointed it at Craig's head. The Russians spread out to cover the exits. Blake pulled his own weapon, a small silver pistol that looked expensive and well-maintained. Agent Cooper? Blake's voice was deadly calm. FBI. Craig looked at Ferguson, who met his eyes with something that might have been sympathy. The DEA agent had just sacrificed his cover to blow Craig's, probably saving Craig's life in the process. "I'm not FBI," Craig said, which was technically true. "I'm a civilian consultant." "Semantics," Blake said. "You've been wearing a wire." "Not tonight." Craig spread his arms to show he wasn't armed. "Quinn pulled me off the operation yesterday. I came here on my own." Blake studied Craig's face for a long moment. "Why?" "Because 10 years in federal prison isn't enough. Not for what you did to my father." Blake actually laughed. "Revenge? After all this, it comes down to simple revenge. You destroyed everything my father built. You made him die thinking he was a failure. And you were going to have your pet psychopath kill me after she'd stolen everything I owned. So you decided to infiltrate my operation and bring me down personally." Blake lowered his gun slightly. "I have to admit, Craig, I'm impressed. You had me completely fooled. The FBI has recordings of you confessing to destroying Cooper Construction," Craig continued. "They have evidence of your money laundering operation. Even if you kill me tonight, you're finished." "Maybe, but if I'm going to prison, I might as well make it worthwhile." Blake raised his gun again. "Goodbye, Craig Cooper." That's when the warehouse lights exploded in a shower of sparks, plunging them into darkness. Craig dove to his left as Blake's gun fired, the muzzle flash temporarily blinding everyone. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, casting everything in hellish red shadows. "FBI! FBI! Get on the ground!" The warehouse filled with tactical officers in full combat gear. Craig found himself face down on the concrete, with someone's knee in his back and zip ties around his wrists before he could identify himself. "Agent Cooper is friendly," he heard Ferguson yell. "Agent Cooper is an asset." The knee left Craig's back, and someone cut his zip ties. He rolled over to see Quinn kneeling beside him, his face grim with relief and anger. "Are you completely insane?" Quinn demanded. "You could have gotten yourself killed." "Where's Blake?" Quinn helped Craig to his feet and pointed toward the far corner of the warehouse, where Blake was being treated by paramedics. "Caught some shrapnel when we blew the lights. He'll live to stand trial." Craig walked over to where Blake lay on a stretcher, his expensive suit torn and bloody. Blake looked up at Craig with something that might have been respect. "You played this well, Craig. Better than I expected. This isn't about the game, Blake. This is about justice." "Justice?" Blake's laugh turned into a cough. "You stood there and watched me torture 2 people. You participated in kidnapping and conspiracy to commit murder. What makes you think you're any different from me now?" Craig stared down at the man who destroyed his father's life and nearly destroyed his own. "The difference is that I'll have to live with what I've done. You never care about the people you hurt." Noble sentiment. Let's see how noble you feel when you're testifying about tonight in court. When Elena's victims' families ask why you didn't try to stop me sooner. Blake was loaded into an ambulance a few minutes later, still conscious and still smiling his predatory smile. Craig watched the ambulance drive away, feeling hollow rather than victorious. "Ferguson's going to be fine," Quinn said, joining Craig outside the warehouse. "Tough bastard. Says he's been through worse in Moscow." "And Elena?" "Still in federal custody. With Blake's confession and Ferguson's testimony, she'll never see the outside of a prison cell." Craig nodded absently, his mind already racing ahead to the trials, the testimony, the media attention that would follow. His quiet life as an architect was over. His name would be forever linked to this case. "Craig," Quinn said quietly, "for what it's worth, you did the right thing. Blake Root was a cancer. Sometimes you have to cut deep to remove cancer completely." Craig looked back at the warehouse, where crime scene investigators were already documenting evidence. The ends justify the means? In this case? Yeah, I think they do. As Craig drove home through the empty streets of Los Angeles, he tried to feel victorious. Blake Root was finished. Elena would spend the rest of her life in prison. Justice had been served. But all Craig could think about was Blake's final question. What made him any different from the people he'd helped bring down? The answer, Craig realized, was that he wasn't sure there was a difference anymore. Chapter 8. Revelations and Reckonings. The Los Angeles County Courthouse was a circus of media attention 3 months later when Blake Root's trial began. Craig sat in the witness waiting room, reviewing his testimony notes for the fifth time that morning, trying to ignore the reporters shouting questions through the security glass. Mr. Cooper, is it true you participated in the torture of 2 federal agents? How do you respond to claims that you enjoyed watching the interrogations? Are you worried about retaliation from Blake Root's criminal associates? Quinn appeared at Craig's elbow, coffee in hand and irritation on his face. The media's having a field day with this. Blake's defense team is pushing the narrative that you went rogue, that everything you did was unauthorized. It was unauthorized, Craig pointed out. Technically, yes, but you were still acting as our asset when you gathered most of the evidence. Quinn sat down beside Craig. The recordings we have of Blake confessing to destroying your father's company, those are going to put him away for life. And the torture charges? Those are trickier. Blake's lawyers are claiming he was conducting legitimate interrogations of suspected criminals. They're painting Kelvin Maloney as a willing accomplice and Ferguson as a deep-cover criminal, not a DEA agent. Craig looked up from his notes. They can do that. They could try. But we have Blake on tape ordering Maloney's murder, and Ferguson's credentials are solid. Quinn paused. The question is how the jury reacts to your role in all this. Before Craig could respond, a bailiff appeared. Mr. Cooper, you're up. The courtroom was packed with reporters, federal agents, and spectators drawn by the sensational nature of the case. Blake sat at the defense table in an expensive suit, looking every inch the successful businessman rather than the criminal mastermind he actually was. His eyes found Craig's as Craig walked to the witness stand, and his smile was as coldly predatory as ever. The prosecution's questioning was straightforward, established Craig's background, his relationship with Elena, and his discovery that she was working for Blake. Craig had practiced these answers dozens of times, and he delivered them clearly and calmly. Then Blake's defense attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Elizabeth Parsons, began her cross-examination. Mr. Cooper, you've testified that you were working with the FBI to gather evidence against my client. Is that accurate? Yes, ma'am. But you also testified that on the night of Stanley Ferguson's interrogation, you were not wearing any FBI recording equipment. Is that correct? Craig felt the first stirring of unease. That's correct. And you made the decision to attend that interrogation without FBI knowledge or approval. Yes. So, when you stood in that warehouse and watched my client question Mr. Ferguson, you were not acting as an FBI asset. You were acting as Craig Cooper, private citizen. Correct. I suppose so, yes. Parsons smiled. And as a private citizen, Mr. Cooper, you participated in the kidnapping and assault of Stanley Ferguson. You watched as he was tortured for information. You made no attempt to help him or to contact authorities. Is that accurate? Quinn was on his feet immediately. Objection, Your Honor. Compound question and assumes facts, not an evidence. Sustained. Ms. Parsons, please rephrase. Mr. Cooper, did you at any point during Mr. Ferguson's interrogation attempt to stop what was happening? Craig stared at Blake's lawyer, realizing the trap she was setting. No, I did not. Did you at any point try to contact law enforcement to report what was happening? No. Did you at any point express objection to what was being done to Mr. Ferguson? No. In fact, isn't it true that you encouraged my client's actions? That you told him you wanted to look Ferguson in the eye when he revealed information about Elena Kozlov's assets? Craig's mouth went dry. Blake's people had been recording their conversations too. I was maintaining my cover. Your cover as what, Mr. Cooper? You just testified that you weren't acting as an FBI asset that night. So what cover were you maintaining? Craig looked at Quinn, who was clearly preparing another objection, but the damage was already done. The jury had heard what they needed to hear. I was trying to appear willing to participate so I could gather evidence. Evidence that would never be admissible in court because it was gathered illegally by a private citizen engaging in vigilante justice. Objection. Withdrawn. Parsons smiled coldly. No further questions. Craig left the witness stand feeling like he'd been gutted. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Quinn tried to reassure him, but they both knew the defense had scored major points. She's trying to make it seem like you and Blake were co-conspirators who had a falling out, Quinn explained. The jury needs to understand that you were working undercover to bring Blake down. But I wasn't, was I? Craig said quietly. That last night, I wasn't working undercover for the FBI. I was there for my own reasons. Quinn didn't answer immediately. What were your reasons, Craig? Craig thought about it. I wanted to see Blake destroy himself. I wanted to watch him commit crimes so heinous that he'd never get out of prison. And did that happen? Yes. Blake ordered Kelvin Maloney's murder on tape. He personally participated in torturing a federal agent. Whatever his lawyers argue, those are capital crimes. Then you accomplish your goal. Craig looked back toward the courtroom, where Blake was undoubtedly conferring with his expensive legal team. Did I? Or did I just become as ruthless as he is? The question haunted Craig through 3 more days of testimony. Elena took the stand and provided devastating evidence about Blake's criminal operation, confirming that he'd hired her specifically to target Craig. Ferguson testified about the systematic torture he'd endured, describing Blake's personal participation in graphic detail. But Blake's defense team kept returning to the same theme. Craig Cooper was not a hero, but a vigilante who had participated in serious crimes. They painted him as an architect who'd snapped after discovering his wife's betrayal and decided to take justice into his own hands. The worst part was that Craig wasn't entirely sure they were wrong. On the final day of testimony, Blake himself took the stand. His lawyers had tried to prevent it, but Blake insisted on speaking in his own defense. I've been in construction and development for 25 years, Blake testified smoothly. I've built shopping centers, office buildings, residential complexes. I provided jobs for thousands of people and homes for thousands more. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Beverly Valencia, was clearly skeptical. Mr. Root, are you denying that you operated a money laundering business? I'm saying that sometimes, in business, you work with people whose backgrounds aren't entirely clean. But that doesn't make me a criminal. What about the systematic destruction of Cooper Construction? Blake's expression hardened slightly. David Cooper's business failed because of poor decisions and market forces. I had nothing to do with that. But you've been recorded confessing to engineering that failure. I've been recorded having a conversation with a man who was secretly working with federal agents to entrap me. A man who participated in kidnapping and torture to get those recordings. Blake looked directly at Craig, who was sitting in the gallery. Craig Cooper is not a victim in this case. He's a co-conspirator who made a deal with the government to avoid prosecution for his own crimes. The statement hung in the courtroom like an accusation. Craig felt every eye in the room turn to him, and for a moment, he wondered if Blake was right. Had Craig become the villain of his own story? Chapter 9, Justice Served. The jury deliberated for 18 hours across 3 days. Craig spent that time in a downtown hotel, avoiding the media circus and trying to process everything that had happened over the past 6 months. His quiet life as an architect was over. Win or lose, he'd be forever known as the man who went undercover to bring down his wife's criminal conspirator. Quinn called him on the morning of the 3rd day. Jury's coming back. Whatever happens, Craig, you need to know that Blake Root is finished. Even if he beats the major charges, we've got him on enough federal counts to put him away for decades. Craig dressed carefully in his best suit, the same one he'd worn to his wedding to Elena. It seemed appropriate. Somehow, both occasions had been performances, carefully orchestrated deceptions with life-altering consequences. The courthouse was even more crowded than it had been during testimony. Blake's criminal associates, Elena's previous victims' families, federal agents, reporters, and curiosity seekers packed every available seat. Craig found a spot near the back, preferring to remain inconspicuous. Blake sat at the defense table looking confident and relaxed, as if this were just another business meeting. When the jury filed in, Craig tried to read their faces, but they were carefully neutral. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Muhammad Hodge asked. We have, Your Honor. The foreman, a middle-aged man who'd worked construction most of his life, stood to read the verdict. Craig found himself holding his breath. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. Blake's confident expression faltered slightly. On the charge of operating a continuing criminal enterprise, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of money laundering in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of kidnapping, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of torture, we find the defendant guilty. The verdicts continued for 15 minutes. Guilty on every major charge. Guilty on most of the lesser charges. By the time the foreman finished reading, Blake Root was looking at multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. As the judge dismissed the jury and scheduled sentencing for the following month, Blake turned to look at Craig one final time. His expression was no longer predatory or confident. For the first time since Craig had met him, Blake Root looked like what he truly was, a defeated criminal facing the end of his life in federal prison. Craig expected to feel vindicated, triumphant, satisfied that justice had finally been served. Instead, he felt hollow. Blake Root was finished, but so was the person Craig had been before this all started. The architect who'd lived quietly and tried to build beautiful buildings was gone, replaced by someone who could watch torture without flinching. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Craig despite Quinn's attempts to run interference. How do you feel about the verdict, Mr. Cooper? Do you regret your decision to go undercover? What's next for you? Craig paused on the courthouse steps, looking back at the building where Blake Root had just been convicted of crimes that would keep him locked away forever. I'm glad Blake Root can't hurt anyone else, Craig said finally. But I'm not sure justice can repair the damage he's already done. To my father, to his other victims, or to the people who became capable of stopping him. Are you referring to yourself, Mr. Cooper? Craig thought about the question. 6 months ago, he'd been a successful architect married to a woman he loved, believing his biggest problem was taking time off for a vacation. Now he was a federal witness whose testimony had helped convict multiple criminals, a man who'd watched torture and done nothing to stop it, someone who discovered that he was capable of ruthlessness when pushed far enough. Yes, he said quietly, I'm referring to myself. The media circus followed Craig for another month, until Blake's sentencing hearing provided a final act to the drama. Blake received 4 life sentences plus 300 years in federal prison. Elena received 2 life sentences. Her various associates, including the surviving members of Kelvin Maloney's crew, received sentences ranging from 20 years to life. Craig watched the sentencing from the back of the courtroom, and when it was over, he walked out into the Los Angeles sunshine, feeling something he hadn't felt in months. Peace. Not happiness. He wasn't sure he'd ever be truly happy again. But peace, the knowledge that Blake Root would never hurt another family the way he'd hurt the Coopers. That evening, Craig stood in his rebuilt home office, looking at the architectural drawings spread across his desk. The Morrison project was still waiting for his attention, just as Elena had predicted months ago. His life was still there, ready to be resumed. But Craig knew he could never truly go back. He'd learned too much about himself, about the thin line between justice and revenge, about the price of stopping truly evil people. His phone rang. Quinn, I wanted to let you know, we got word that Elena's death sentence was commuted to life without parole. Apparently, her cooperation in the Blake Root case was considered a mitigating factor. Good, Craig said, surprising himself. She's a killer, but you're not. Craig thought about the question. I don't know what I am anymore, Quinn. I know I'm not the same person I was 6 months ago. Maybe that's not a bad thing. The person you were 6 months ago would have let Blake Root destroy more families. The person you are now stopped him. After Quinn hung up, Craig walked to his living room window and looked out at the city lights of Los Angeles. Somewhere out there, Blake Root was beginning his first night of what would be decades in federal prison. Somewhere else, Elena Kozlov was doing the same. The conspiracy that had destroyed his father and nearly killed him was finally, definitively over. Craig poured himself a glass of whiskey, something he rarely did, and raised it in a silent toast. To David Cooper, he said aloud, your son turned out to be stronger than either of us thought. As Craig drank the whiskey and planned his return to the business of designing buildings instead of destroying criminal enterprises, he realized that Blake Root had been wrong about one thing.